So I just want to, again, welcome everybody. This is VSP3111, Cisco Nexus 1000v Architecture Deployment and Management. Hopefully you're in the right place. I don't think they changed rooms on me today, so hopefully everybody knows where they're at. Real quick, my name is Jason Nash, VCDex number 49, vExpert, blah, blah, blah. I'm the data center principal for Vero. We're a really cool data center provider or a data center partner based out of the Southeast, out of the Carolinas. If you can't tell by my accent, I'm based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. So we'll go ahead and get started. So what are we going to talk about? Well, I'm doing three sessions, two different topics this week. One of them I do a compare and contrast on the vSphere distributed switch to the 1KV. Did it yesterday or did it Monday? I'm doing another one tomorrow. This one is specifically on the 1000V. So we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about architecture. How's this thing put together? What are the components? How do they talk to each other? Complexity. And I don't want you to think complexity meaning it's complex. It's not. But I want you to look at what it takes to deploy and manage this system and make sure it fits your environment or your organization or your support structures. That's one issue that we have seen in the field when we do deployments with this. Next, features. That's real simple. We'll do a feature comparison real quick, kind of tell you why the 1000V is so really cool, really great, but also so that you know that what you get by stepping over to that, and maybe you don't need those things, so maybe you need to reconsider. Cost. We'll talk a little bit real quick about licensing and deployment considerations, and then management. What's my day-to-day care and feeding of this thing? What's the network admin got to do when I make a request for a new port group? Things like that. So a lot of times when I do these sessions, I have my own gear. I do live deployments here on my gear. We can kind of change things. People can ask questions. Unfortunately, given what we're doing here at VMworld, that's a little bit tougher. So I've got videos that I've done from my lab, same thing that I normally do. We'll talk through them and stop and do some things along the way. Hopefully that'll at least kind of convey what I'm trying to show you here, because I'm a big fan of seeing something in action and less of talking about it in PowerPoint bullets. And ask questions. Hopefully I can answer them. We may wait to the end. If you've got a quick one, throw your hand up. I'll have to ask you to go to one of the microphones, or the people in the back get really mad at me. But at the end, we should have time. I may be close. We'll just have to see. So real quick on the advantages. First of all, what is the 1000V? So if you're not really familiar with it, first, what is it? Well, it's a replacement for the vSphere switching system. So you kind of have three options when we talk about networking with vSphere. We have your standard good old vSwitches, things we've had for a long time. They're easy, they're simple. You can do all kind of really neat things with them. And if you completely blow it up, you can jump on the command line and rebuild them in a matter of minutes. Then we've got the vSphere distributed switch, the VDS. It has gotten better, and better. It was good in 4, better in 4.1, pretty good in 5. So they're adding a lot of features and functionality to the VDS, which often leads to a question when I talk to somebody, which is, well, which one do I need? Do I need VDS? Do I need the 1000V? Where does that fit? And we'll talk about that more in a minute, and it really comes down to what are your requirements, not just technical checklist, I need this, so therefore I have to go to there, but also you may be in an organizational requirement. One thing the 1000V lets you do is kind of split the network out from the rest of the virtual infrastructure. So you may be an organization with a separate network team who manages all the other equipment, usually Cisco equipment when we're talking about this. And therefore, they want to manage the network. They want to manage the security policies. They want to manage, QoS and all that stuff. So a lot of times it's not really a feature discussion on why we go with the 1000V. It's more we want to move that line back and give the network to the network team. Instead, you may be an organization where the vSphere team or the server team manages everything. So that may not be an issue for you. But that is one draw we see where it's not just checklist and features and support. So again, here's your kind of advantages. If I'm on vSwitches, why would I go to the 1000V? Well, single management, very powerful, getting a lot of features that you normally wouldn't get. If you're already on the vSphere distributed switch, and I encourage you to take a look at what's in 5, if you're on 4 or 4.1 now, make sure you do a comparison to 5, but you get some other things. You get Cisco interface. So this will look, and we'll talk about this more in a second, but it's going to look like a Cisco switch. If you've played with a 4500, 6500, something like that, or a Nexus within XOS, this is going to be very, very familiar to you. If you're not used to those things, this is going to be very, very foreign to you. So you'll see that. But in most cases, the network team is used to managing this type of an interface. More advanced features, which we'll go over in a minute. Again, that gap is, well, I won't say it's shrinking, But as the Nexus kind of runs out with new cool stuff, the VDS is also catching up on some other areas. And better integration with other components, which we'll also hit on a little bit, but things like virtual WAS for application acceleration, VSG, Virtual Security Gateway for kind of multi-tenancy environments, and they're doing tech previews of the virtual ASA appliance as well. So you're getting some really neat integration features with the 1000v. So here's the quick feature checklist, all right? And unfortunately, sometimes it's a little bit more gray area. So single management. Both distributed switching options have it. That's kind of like what we do them for in most cases. So you can manage both of them from one place. Virtual port channels. If you're not familiar with this, this is kind of carryover from the Cisco Nexus hardware switching line, which allows us to do some neat port channeling and failover things to separate switches, non-clustered switches, and the 1000v gives you more flexibility and configuration options. LACP support. So the only option right now, if you big user of LACP, is the 1000v. Flexible load balancing, and that's not really fair on this one. I need to revise this slide a little bit. If you're a VDS user in 4.1, and especially now in 5, we've got things like load-based teaming, which basically does teaming and NIC utilization based on load. So that's pretty nice. But the 1000v gives you a lot of different hashing and balancing features and options. If you've used a Cisco switch or really any hardware switch, there'll be 16 different ways that you can hash traffic depending on your workloads. A lot of those are in here that you don't get exposed with the standard VMware offerings. QoS tagging, VDS and 1KV do it. I'm not going to go too deep into QoS here, but the 1000v does more with QoS and queuing than the VDS does. The VDS does a really good job for the simplicity that is network I/O control, especially now in 5. With 4.1, we had network I/O control. I can do shares and limits on different types of traffic, much like I do CPU and memory. But in 4.1, all of my VM's traffic had one share value. So whether it was high priority, low priority, whatever, you got lumped into one group. With 5 on the VDS, I can now split those out with network resource pools. So some people, and you'll hear me say this a few times, it's good enough. Once something is good enough, that's what they'll go with. So it's good enough for some people. For others, we get better QoS support with the 1KV. And private VLANs. How many people are using private VLANs? That's weird, okay? So I had a compare and contrast session on Monday, and like half the room raised their arms. So either that's a different audience or they didn't really know what private VLANs were. So one of those two. They both support private VLANs. The VDS needs a physical switch that also supports and understands private VLANs. The 1KV can do it all in software. That's a little bit of a technical issue. Most people are deploying this, have support, but it's one of those things that Cisco always likes to remind me of when I talk to them. Well, don't forget, you got to have hardware for that. Okay. Next, real quick, access control list. So if you've ever used a Cisco switch, right, I can do access control lists. It's not stateful firewalling, but it's access control list. I can do the same here. Can't do that on the others without other add-ons. Some people use those. Most people want something more powerful. Security features. They're listed down at the bottom, such as DHCP snooping, IP source guard, dynamic ARP inspection. We see requests for these a lot of times in VDI environments. So it's a great way to kind of put an extra level of port security in your VDI environment. Port mirroring. VDS now has port mirroring. If you're at my Monday session or the one tomorrow, you'll see a quick configuration demo of that. But it's a little bit more limited in what you can do than with the 1KV. So it's basically, I want all of that traffic to go over there to another VM or to another uplink. You don't really get to pick what kind of traffic. You can't point it to an IP address for encapsulating. You can't do several things. But it's really darn easy to use, and it works well, and it's included. Whereas with the 1KV, you get a little bit more flexibility. You'll hear me keep harping on flexibility, and that's kind of what we talk about. NetFlow, great example. How many people here use NetFlow? Okay. How many people here use version 5? 9. Don't know what version you use. There you go. So odds are you're probably using version 5, right? That's the majority of people out there, that's what they're using. 9 adds some great features. You can do some things. You can get more configurable on what kind of information you get or you don't get. So that's also one of these little kind of things that version 5 is in VDS with vSphere 5, version 9 with the 1KV. Both of them do CDP and LLDP. If you're a Cisco shop and do a show CDP neighbors, that's CDP. LLDP is like the industry standard version of that. And finally, vPath integration. vPath is this Cisco thing that basically lets the vSphere host, or a piece of software we'll talk about in a minute, be rather intelligent. I'll do a comparison to like vShield zones. vShield zones, if I want to do a software kind of virtual firewall using VM-safe technology, I deploy a service VM to every host in my cluster. It's not a big deal. It's just a requirement of vShield zones. That way, all the traffic gets processed right there. With vPath and the 1KV and something like the new Virtual Secure Gateway, I don't do that. The management piece of the VSG, using vPath and all this, pushes policies down to the vSphere host. They make intelligent decisions without running service VMs. That's called vPath integration. Things like virtual WAS, VSG, the ASA, those will take advantage of this technology and let it kind of plug things into the virtual switch a little bit more efficiently than what we could do with, say, vShield. So that's my feature set comparison list. So you can kind of look at that and see if there's something you need that's on the right side of the chart that's not on the middle side of the chart that may force your hand to go another direction. Now I want to talk a little bit about architecture. This is kind of important to understand because it clears up a lot of things about how the 1KV operates for people. It also kind of starts helping it click in people's head of how you fit this in your environment. So, if you're a Cisco person, I'm a Cisco person, you're probably going to like what you see. Think of it like a chassis switch. How many people here have ever used like a 4500 or 6500 or really anybody else's chassis switch? Okay, good many people, right? We have a chassis. We normally have some sort of control management plane in a 6545 or supervisor modules. Normally, we do 2 of them for redundancy. The rest of the chassis is filled with some sort of a module. Being vSphere and what we're doing here, the only kind of module you can put in this virtual switch is an Ethernet module. I don't have a virtual token ring module or anything like that, but it's all Ethernet modules. So, you start off with 2 virtual supervisor modules. They are the control plane. They manage the operation. Then, each vSphere host is going to appear like a module in a chassis switch. One pair of VSMs can manage 64 different vSphere hosts. Therefore, it's like jumping onto a 66-slot chassis switch. When I log into the interface or show a demo, you're going to kind of get that. I can do a show module command, Virtual Supervisor 1, Virtual Supervisor 2, and vSphere host whatever to whatever we've deployed as a module. So it really is like a virtual chassis switch. And that makes a lot of sense to the network teams. When I go and deploy this and talk to customers, and I sit, the server admins and the network admins are in the room, the network admins usually get this a little bit quicker because it all makes sense as far as chassis. Normally, again, you deploy those VSMs, those virtual supervisor modules, in pairs. You'll notice it says not licensed. So I'll tell you how this is licensed now. One benefit of the vSphere distributed switch is if you have Enterprise Plus licensing, you're done. You've got everything you need. You can deploy it. And you can run around and do whatever you want to do. With this, you buy Enterprise Plus, and then you buy a socket of license for each vSphere host that you're going to manage with this. So if I have 10 vSphere hosts, 2 sockets each, I buy 20 sockets of Nexus 1000v licensing. You do not license the VSMs. If I deploy 1 or I deploy 2, the price is the same, nothing. If I buy 1 socket of licensing, I can deploy 2 VSMs. So there's no reason not to. Each vSphere host gets what's called the VEM, or the VEM Virtual Ethernet module. You deploy this piece of software, and we'll show you that, and that's what you license. So again, it's per socket, that's the piece you license. Make sense? That's a question I get a lot. VSMs, not licensed. No reason not to deploy 2. Here is a logical kind of diagram. And really what I want to show is that it's kind of like having this switch here. You've got your VEMs deployed to each of your hosts and your VSMs here. VSMs are software, but they can be deployed in 2 different ways. Most common way is as a virtual appliance. Using an OVF file or an ISO file, we deploy them to a vSphere cluster. It can be the same cluster that they're managing. It can be a management cluster over there. I can do crazy things like have cluster 1 manage 2 and 2 manage 1, whatever. It's just a virtual application. You now have you've had the option for a while of doing a hardware appliance. Network teams like hardware appliances. They like to have their gear in a rack somewhere that they can touch it and know that it's mine. They're also, and I agree with them on this, right? I don't usually want the thing that's managing something to live in what I'm managing. So, it is fully supported to do that, Usually the server guys are much more comfortable with that than the network teams. But if you want to do a hardware deployment, you can. It's called a Nexus 1010. It is a one-use server. You deploy them again in pairs. And the neat thing is they can run multiple VSMs. They can manage multiple VSM deployments. And they can also do things like run the virtual security gateway on those. So they keep adding good functionality to those appliances. They're becoming more and more popular. Also, real quick, it used to be you bought 1010s and they came with 1000v licensing, usually 32 sockets. Some people who already had licensing didn't like that, so now you can buy them either or, with or without. That's just something that's changed recently. So, VSMs manage this virtual switch as an appliance, software, or hardware. VEMs are a piece of software we put on each vSphere host. They have to talk to each other. And this is where most people get lost. Okay? This is also where you run into your first big troubleshooting problem on a new deployment. Communication doesn't work. So, they communicate for a couple of reasons. One, I have to pass configuration information. I have to pass configuration down the VEMs. I also keep heartbeat between VEM and VSM, or VSM and VSM for VSM failover. So you have to make sure this works. What normally happens is people deploy VSM number 1 and configure it. Then they deploy VSM number 2, and they're supposed to replicate. Instead, I've got 2 VSMs that each think they're active, and they're the only guy in town because they're not talking to each other. So you have 2 options for connectivity. We have the original option classic or whatever. It's layer 2. A lot of times, network guys like this option because it only uses VLANs. No IP addresses involved, nothing like that. And you have some VLANs that are extended from the vSphere host to the VSM, whether he lives in a piece of hardware or a piece of software. And they communicate over layer 2 with no IP addresses. There's also a layer 3 option. The VSM has an IP. The vSphere host has IP. It's a VM kernel interface. It has an IP. And they basically tunnel the layer 2 stuff through a GRE tunnel, but it uses IP-based connectivity. There are some advantages to that, disadvantages to that, but you have 2 options. Most common we see is layer 2. Why? Because it's the original. There's more documentation on it. There's more troubleshooting information on it. It's usually the simplest. You have people like me who've been doing it since first version, and I don't change my ways unless I have to. So that's what we do, and it's well tested. It's still kind of the default, and you'll see that during the software deployments. My suggestion is to do that if it's your first implementation, or at least lab both ones and see what you prefer. Or if you have reasoning that you just don't want to use layer 2, maybe VLANs are constrained, and go to layer 3. Here's a quick screenshot of layer 2 communication. So, I don't know if you can read this in the back. I'm going to post all these slides up. They'll be on VMware site. All the videos in this slide deck will be on my blog. I'll link at the end. But what I wanted to show you is the VSMs have 3 network adapters. One pertains to each VLAN. There are 3 VLANs. We call them management, control, and packet. Management is very simple. It's the one you SSH into. So he's going to have the control interface or the management interface that I SSH into. It's also what's going to be used to connect to vCenter. So vCenter has to talk to the VSM for understanding what port groups are configured and things like that. That's also the same interface. Next is control. This is the one that causes problems. Control is what is used to talk from VSM1, VSM2, and from the VSMs down to each vSphere host with the virtual Ethernet modules. All you need to know is if that VLAN is not trunked down to each host or to the 1010, things don't work. Okay? This is 95% of the problems we run into with deployments are this. If you're a partner, you're a consultant, customers will unintentionally lie to you all the time. You know, are you trunking this down? Absolutely, Jason, yes. Are you trunking it between your 2 switches top? Oh, absolutely. Can I look at that? Yeah. You do it, show interface, blah, 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 trunk, and it's not being trunked across. And that causes all sorts of weird issues. Normally, you have 2 VSMs that don't talk to each other. Or I bring a vSphere host, the first one online, install the VEM, and it never appears as a module. That is due to control VLAN problems. Tell you right now, that's what it is. First thing they're going to ask you when you call VMware support or TAC. The last one is packet. Packet is really simple. Any packet data goes over this, mainly CDP and things like span traffic if you're doing port mirroring. So if you want port mirrored traffic to go over some VLAN, a separate VLAN, you put this in a different VLAN. CIsco now says You can share VLANs amongst these. Version 1 release, they wanted 3 separate VLANs. Now they don't care. The only thing they really care about is do not, and that's not right. The only thing they care about is do not use, my pointer's not working, there it is, VLAN 1 for control. Why not? Because with Cisco switches, VLAN 1 basically lives everywhere, right? A lot of stuff runs over it. What happens if I start doing broadcast frames out control VLAN? All over the place. So don't do that. Don't use VLAN 1 for stuff like that anyway. But, don't do it here. The other thing is, my pointer, up here, control, management, and packet for the 3 adapters. That's all you need to know. Make sure when you boot or install this thing, we'll see it in a minute, it's going to ask you which one to use for each, and I'll show you. Finally, if I have multiple 1000v implementations, I can use different domain IDs. Thank you, sir. I can use different, what we call domain IDs. So I can share VLANs. Let's say I use VLAN 10, 11, and 12. And I want to use 10, 11, and 12 for this 1000v implementation and this one over there. You can absolutely do that. They will not get confused because when we deploy it, we give them what's known as a domain ID. Basically, we all talk on domain 1 here and domain 2 over there, and we don't crisscross. You'll see that again during deployment. Layer 2 or Layer 3, we kind of talked about that already. What's constrained, VLANs or IPs? What do you want to manage? Usually, outside of like a service provider, VLANs aren't constrained, but it happens. Layer 3 is useful, and stay with me on this one. If you want a VSM over there on one IP segment or one Layer 2 network to manage vSphere hosts on another Layer 2 domain or different segment. But here's the thing. A VSM can only manage, that's not said correctly, can only manage a group of VMs in a single Layer 2 domain. What I mean by that, this side of the stage is a Layer 2 network. I'm a VSM living on a cluster of vSphere hosts, okay? Over there is another cluster in a separate Layer 2 network. If I want to manage those, I can't manage these and those. It's one or the other. So what normally happens is I have a management cluster here with other sorts of management things with one set of VSMs managing what I'm standing on, and I manage those over there. Does that make sense? Basically, your vSphere hosts have to be in a single Layer 2 domain to be managed. I can't manage them all over the place. That confuses some people, especially because it's not really well written in the documentation. Deployment considerations. 1KV is like a Cisco switch. If you don't have Cisco knowledge in-house, you're going to have issues. I have deployed these into Nortel shops and HP shops. I always ask the question, well, who's going to manage this? Do you have a Cisco guy on staff? No. Well, who's going to manage this? And they say, well, we'll learn it. And that's fine. I'm all about that. But just keep in mind that all your management is done through a Cisco command line, NXOS. It's not done through vCenter. You can't do anything in vCenter. No changes, no port group creations, nothing. The only thing you can do is once a port group shows up because someone created in the Cisco switch, I can add a VM to it. That's it. That's all you can do. Everything else is through the NXOS command line. Multiple uplink profiles are easy. What I mean by this is, with the vSphere distributed switch, I only have one uplink profile. I get into more of this on my compare and contrast, but bottom line is, if I want to physically separate traffic on NICs, I think, and I have to preface this statement, I think it's easier to do it with this than it is, say, the VMware switch. Because with the VMware switch, I can only trunk one configuration of VLANs. If I want to say these NICs are only going to trunk VLAN 5, and these NICs are only going to trunk VLANs 20 through 30, I have to do some funny things. Either I have to deploy multiple virtual distributed switches in VMware, or do some weird active standby unused configurations of my port groups with NICs. I'll show you what I mean about this more, but it comes up when we talk about DMZs and other sort of segmented environments. But you can do multiple different uplink configurations, so some NICs can carry some VLANs, other NICs carry other VLANs, and they're still all managed from one switch. Multiple clusters, multiple VSMs. Single pair of VSMs can manage many different things, different clusters, or you can do, some people like to do VSMs for this cluster, VSMs for that cluster. You don't license VSMs, so really it's up to how you want to manage it, not some sort of other limitation. So here's the deployment steps, and we'll go through a video here in a minute, and it'll probably make a lot more sense than me talking. Deploying it is a multi-step process. Yes, everything's a multi-step process. But what I mean by that is, with like the vSphere distributed switch, I pretty much do everything in vCenter. That's not the case here. Step one, we deploy the first VSM using your preferred method. What I mean by that is, do you want to use an OVA file, do you want to use an ISO file, or whatever? I don't care, it doesn't really matter, end result's the same. Then we perform basic configuration. This is enough to get it online talking to vCenter. Normally I do this with a Java GUI, Java application. You can do a basic manual setup using command line. Anybody here ever booted up a CIsco switch and walked through that little text, get me online in basic configuration? You would see the same thing, or you can use the Java GUI. Java GUI used to suck. It is now much better, and that's what I use now because it's simple and it works. Then we can deploy the second VSM. We don't really do anything to it. We boot it up, point it at the domain ID and a little bit of information, and it talks to the other one and pulls the config. Then we create our port group and uplink profile configurations. And finally, we start moving hosts into it and moving VMs into it. Couple of recommendations. Always deploy VSM in pairs. We've talked about that. What you want to do is make sure and deploy them to multiple data stores. VSM1 goes on that data store. VSM2 goes on that data store. You don't want to lose the data store and take out both your VSMs. All right? Manual vMotion is fine. You can manually vMotion these things. CIsco recommends you exclude from DRS. Reason is, sometimes you'll vMotion a VM and you'll drop a frame or a packet as it does the gratuitous ARP and all that stuff. They think if DRS spazzes out and starts moving VSMs all over, you're going to start dropping connections. I don't know if I totally agree with that, but try to exclude it from DRS, but you can manually vMotion it if you want to put a host in maintenance mode. Fully supported to run everything, even vCenter, through the 1KV. I have 10 servers. All of them have two 10-gig NICs, and that's all they have. I don't really want to leave NICs out of this and say, I want some things on the old vSwitch just for vCenter, just in case. Everything is supported to be run through the 1KV. The VSM, your virtual center, all that stuff. So you can go to a 100% distributed switch configuration. No need to back up the VSM. Don't worry about backing up that VM. Back up the configuration like you would any other Cisco device. It's easy to redeploy a new VSM and dump that config back on it. So don't worry about backing up the actual VM. Run the latest code. What did I say? Run the latest code. If you're one of those organizations that usually runs one back rev back because you don't trust the latest and greatest, this is not the time to do that. And I'm not trying to scare anybody or I'm not trying to say anything's wrong, but there have been issues, okay? The latest right now is 1.4a. Run 1.4a. If you're on 1.2, you're on 1.3, highly suggested you make the move to 1.4a. There have been quirky issues, don't get caught. Snapshots and clones are not supported on the VSM. Why would you do that? You're backing up your config. Don't do that. Primary and standby VSM must be in the same layer 2 domain. That's usually the case all the time, but you can't separate those two out. They will not talk to each other. Latency, really, primary standby VSM, if they're in the same layer 2 domain, really should be less than 100 millisecond. And the VSM to your vSphere host really should be 50 to 100. I don't think that's really causing anybody any pain, but it's out there for consideration. Pretty picture at the bottom is a 1010. It's a Cisco UCS chassis if you haven't seen one. So deploying the VSMs before we jump into the demo. So the first step is deploying these VSMs, and it's done one of two ways. An ISO file, which I don't recommend using. It's kind of a weird configuration. You build a VM just like you normally would, and 2 gigs of memory and this much CPU, and this is where I want to live, and then you boot off the ISO and do an install. Really weird. If you download it, there's an OVA file. Just deploy the OVA file. It's much simpler. It walks you through a little simple setup, and the workflow is just better. And then it's broken out into 2 parts, and I get this question a lot. So when you deploy the OVA, it asks you some questions for basic config. Then we launch a Java application to do some other config. Problem is, the Java application asks you some questions that you just answered a minute ago. So people are like, I messed something up. It's asking me for admin password and IP addresses again. No. The vSphere admin may do the first piece of actually deploying that virtual appliance. Then he may turn around and hand that setup over to the network team who does the rest. The vSphere admin may set a password like VMware 123. And the network team wants a password that's this long with crazy characters. So it's going to ask them to re-enter it again. Don't think you did anything wrong. That's just the way it is. Picture here on the right, you're going to see it again. It's from the OVA configuration. So let's jump in. So we deploy these just like we do any other file, any other OVA. File, deploy. You'll push down or go select the file. There's a couple of things. There's an OVA and an OVF. If you haven't seen those, an OVF is just like an image of a VM, and it just plops it down as data stores and lets you boot. An OVA is like a wrapper around an OVF. So it'll ask you some questions and then let you do the deployment. So we do, let me hold on, stop. So the first thing is you got to give it a name. Very simple, right? Then you want to tell it what cluster or resource pool to deploy to. And then it's going to ask you your first question. What sort of configuration are we going to do? And you're going to have three options. Oop, I jumped past them too quick. You're going to have three options. You're going to have what's called the installer, which is what we're going to do here. Man, videos, this is why I prefer to do live demos. They're actually easier than this. I did the same thing on Monday. Come on, there. So there were three options, and I'm just going to let it go. First option, 1000v installer. It's going to walk me through and ask me some questions. That's what we're going to do here. Second one, 1000v secondary. And if you read the text at the bottom, probably can't read it in the back, it's going to say, hey, I'm about to ask you some questions. But if you're doing a secondary install, skip questions C through E. What does it mean? Answer A and B and leave the other ones blank. Okay? Everybody skips that little message and goes ahead and types everything else in. And it used to cause problems, and I think they fixed the workflow, but you don't have to. Third option is manual install. It's going to dump those things out there, and when you boot it, it's going to walk you through manual text configuration, and it's up to you to complete the rest of it. So always suggested to do the GUI walkthrough. So we'll go ahead and kick that off. Again, where do you want it to go? What resource pool? Which data store? Put the first one on one, the second one on the other. I can't do thin provisioning. And then it's going to say, what are my control management packet VLANs? If you actually call them control management packet, it'll go ahead and pick them for you. Else you have to choose. This is a lab. I get to put them all on the same one because I get to do things in labs you shouldn't do in production. And then I click next. Here's where it's asking me the first questions. What's my domain ID? We talked about that. If you want to have multiple installations, I choose one. Password. What do you want the management IP address to be? The gateway and the subnet mask. Nothing crazy here, right? And once all this is completed, it'll go ahead and deploy that first VSM. Go ahead and have it power on. Now, once this guy deploys and powers on, we're going to open a web browser. We're going to point it to the IP address of that VSM we just powered on. It's going to bring up a web page with three basic things on it. One at the top, start Java application. That's how we do the next piece of the config. Second option is a link to an XML file. That XML file is like a certificate. You can install it into vCenter like a plug-in. And it basically is what authenticates the connection between the VSM and vCenter, so I don't have a rogue vCenter out, or VSM out there just creating port groups willy-nilly or doing things. If you use the Java application for configuration, it does that for you, so don't worry about it. The third thing at the bottom, we'll talk about a little later. It's a matrix list of build numbers between vSphere builds and the VEM builds if you're doing manual configurations. If you're not doing manual deployments of the VEM, which we'll see in a minute, you don't need to worry about that unless you're troubleshooting something to have to do a manual install and you need to go grab the VIB file. So it's being deployed and it's going to boot. And once he boots up, we'll go ahead and load the file. The nice thing about doing manual builds or manual installs of the VEM, since we got a second, is on like vSphere 4, it was a pain. Every time they do a patch, you'd have to get a different build of VEM. And the build number that shows up in vCenter isn't always the kernel build number. So you had to have this matrix, and they were always up and up. With 4.1 and 5, they have this monolithic binary driver support in the kernel. So one build of the VEM will work on any versions of the kernels as long as it's supported. So it made that so much easier than it used to be. It used to be a real hassle. I've actually seen times where wrong VEM would actually install but not work quite right. And you end up chasing your tail for a couple of hours. So it's going to boot up. If you've ever seen a Nexus or NXOS switch boot, it's very similar. It's not very entertaining. And you can log in manually right there. So then I'm going to jump over and open the web interface. Wait for it. Come on. I don't know why I paused when I was doing this video, but I did. Make sure you've got Java 1.6 installed on your workstation. You don't have to do it from the vCenter box. You can load this from anywhere. Type in the IP address I gave it. I think I gave it .3. Yep. Launched installer application at the top. That's Java. XML underneath it. And then you see the little matrix down at the bottom. So we click that. Wait for Java. You can tell these animations have been sped up because Java doesn't take 4 minutes to load. I hate Java. And off we go. First thing it's going to ask for is the password for the VSM, which I just gave it. So it's going to log into it and ask it some questions. Then it says, what's your vCenter IP address? Well, that's easy. And then give me a user ID and password for vCenter. Why? I got to install that XML file. Down at the bottom, use a configuration file. There is an option at the end of this wizard to save all your answers to a file, and you can load them into the next deployment. I'm going to say no, because that would be a very boring demo if I just loaded a file. So we'll keep going. It wants to know where the VSM lives. It needs to know which VM is actually the VSM. Go on. They put some intelligence in this that wasn't in the older versions. It now actually looks for the name VSM. Before you had to pick the VM. Why does it ask for the VM? Because it may not have to make network changes. Here, you can select Layer 2 or Layer 3 configuration. Layer 2, the top one, default Layer 2 is I'm going to use the same VLAN configuration. Basically, I'm going to use the management connection for control and packet. That's what I do in the demo. Advanced lets you pick a different port group for each connection. And if you're not already pre-created, you're like me, you get in a hurry, you get to this far, and you're like, oh man, I forgot to create the port groups. It'll let you do them right in the GUI. And finally, it'll also let you do the Layer 3 configuration. So I'll show you those settings. So it already had the right one. If you do advanced, you can say control, management, and packet down the list and pick different port groups. And here's advanced, and you can say what interface, what IP addresses, things like that. Easiest, if you want to share, is just do the top one. Here, what's your switch name? What name do you want to show up in vCenter? What name do you want appended to the port groups? Then, it's asking you for user or admin password again. If the network team wants a different one, you can put it here. IP information is carried over, and then it's got system redundancy setting or role. By default, it's standalone. You're going to set it to primary. Why? Because you're going to deploy 2 VSMs, because I told you to. And so if you do that, that's primary, the next one will be secondary. If you need a different domain ID, you can do that. And it's going to ask you for your native VLAN. So if you have a native VLAN set to something where frames aren't tagged as they come out of a switch, you put that here. That way it's configured and it knows if I do something with that VLAN, it's not going to tag the frames. So then it's going to run through this entire list of things. It's going to reboot the VSM twice. It's going to do some configurations. It's going to do all sorts of things. So instead of watching that, we're going to go ahead and deploy the second VSM. And again, the second VSM is very simple. We deploy it. We don't really have to configure it. We just boot up and let it grab configuration off the primary. So we'll walk through that. You use the same files, the same OVA file as you did the primary. There's no difference between them. When you download these from CIsco, and you download them from CIsco, not from VMware, you're going to notice that they have 2 separate directories, an install directory and an upgrade directory. Pretty self-explanatory, but the one you're looking for is in the install directory. You see how fast I read that end-user license agreement? Very good. Oh, naming your VSMs. Do not name them VSM primary and VSM secondary or anything like that. You have no idea which one's going to be primary. Something can happen, and it'll cause a reboot, and the other one will take over. You don't set which one is normally primary and which is secondary. They flip back and forth if something happens. So don't confuse yourselves with the guy that comes behind you later trying to debug something and wonders why primary is not really primary. I do 1 and 2 because I have no imagination. But set whatever you want it to set. It's going to ask you for VLANs again. It has to know how to communicate. Make sure whatever you set for control is the same. If the network team in the wizard change that to a different VLAN, you need to know which one it is because you need them to match. And here, if you notice you're paying attention, I accidentally answered the first 3 questions instead of the first 2. I noticed that the other day. But it'll go ahead and deploy. So once that's deployed, you're done with your VSM deployment. The management plane is up and functional. Now, one quick thing. The management of this, the VSMs are not in the data path. What I mean is I can shut both VSMs down and nothing bad happens, except I can't make a change. I can't move a VM. I can't do something like that. Data still flows across the VMs in and out. So they're not in the data path. A lot of people get a little worried about that, but all the switching is handled locally by that virtual Ethernet module on the vSphere host. So our primary is now done with configuration. And it's asked here if we want to save that to a file for later, which I say no. Or I'm sorry, it asked if we want to migrate hosts. So if you've ever deployed the vSphere distributed switch, you have to migrate hosts into it. This asks you if you want to go ahead and migrate them at the end of the wizard. Why is that a bad idea? I haven't done any configuration whatsoever. So I'm not really going to migrate anything with no configuration. So we'll go ahead and let that be. What I'm showing here is there's no settings. There's no manage this. There's no make a new port group that. There's no changes you can make within vCenter. So now that the VSMs are deployed, the management plane is up and functional. The next piece of the puzzle is configuration. Two things you really need to do for basic configuration. There's these other stuff you can do with QoS and that stuff, but to get it online, you got to do port profiles. If you've used an NXOS switch, port profiles are something you may know about. But really what I'm doing is I'm setting configuration of a profile, like VLAN trunking and things like that, and as I apply those to a NIC, they inherit those settings. So there's two types of port profiles. There's Ethernet and vEthernet. Anytime you're talking about the 1000v and someone says this is Ethernet or an Ethernet profile or an Ethernet interface, it's physical. You're talking about that physical NIC on the back of the server that you can touch. It's basic configuration about what kind of trunking and VLANs and things like that. If it's vEthernet, virtual Ethernet, a vEthernet port profile or a vEthernet port, it's something to do with a VM. So it may be a port group or it may be that VM NIC in a VM. The vEthernet port profiles, and I'll give you an example here in just a second, are the things that are your most common administrative change. So the first type of profile is an uplink profile. This configures, and this is one of the more confusing things, this configures the configuration of the physical NICs that plug into your physical switches. Basically, it's what VLANs am I trunking, and if I'm connecting multiple NICs, which you probably are, how do I want to team or balance or whatever those. So that's really the things that you set. A couple of things. Let's say I have a DMZ network, physically separated, isolated layer 2 network. I do an uplink configuration for that on, say, VLAN 50. Production network gets a different uplink port profile configuration, and I want to connect VLANs to that. What happens if I'm using VLAN 50 here and VLAN 50 here? That is fully supported with standard vSwitches, because you can have a vSwitch and VLAN tag here and vSwitch and VLAN tag here, and it just depends on which one I plug the VM into as to which uplinks it goes out of. That's not the case here. This is like one switch connected across your cluster. If he receives a frame destined for VLAN 50, and he's got an uplink that can do 50 there, and an uplink can do 50 there, he doesn't know those networks are separate. He'll pick the first one he sees. And I hit this with a customer a while back. They were using 50 and 50. I wasn't paying attention. 2 hours on the call with TAC. They weren't paying attention. And we found out, and I'm the dumb guy on the phone with the engineers from TAC. And finally I'm like, does it have to do with the fact they're using 50 here and 50 here? And you could just hear people slap their foreheads when I said that. Because you got a 50-50 shot of the frame's going to go up the right connection. So don't overlap VLANs. If you have separate networks, do not overlap. And I suggest you tag all VLAN frames, or tag all VLANs and don't use native VLANs, just for simplicity's sake. I'll show you a configuration here in a second. The other thing to understand is your teaming options. So when I have multiple NICs plugged into some switches, I have to know how to team and load balance them. It's going to ask, right? The 1kV supports LACP, so if you have LACP switches up there, you can do LACP. There's also things called virtual port channel host mode and VPC virtual port channel host mode MAC pinning. So what the 1000v can do is I have two switches. They're not connected or clustered. They're not doing VSS. They're not doing VPC. They're not doing anything like that. They're not stacked. I have 2 separate switches. Normally, that's a problem because I can't really load balance well across those. The 1000V can do some very funny things. So I could have 2 NICs going left and 2 NICs going right, and he will actually port channel these 2 NICs and port channel these 2 NICs and load balance here, and then kind of alternate back and forth. So you can get very intelligent and very granular load balancing. So those are called VPC modes, virtual port channel modes. Normally the one we use is MAC pinning. It's just like MAC pinning or hash based on source MAC in VMware. The reason we see that in a lot of places, and that's Cisco's best practice, is it works everywhere and you don't call TAC with a problem. If I have 8 switches, 8 different vendors, and 8 NICs going to them, I can do MAC pinning and it just works. But if you've got other connected switches, they're a better option. So if you're using something like VSS or VPC or stacking, you can do LACP. The version 1.4 of the Nexus now has what's called LACP offload, meaning in previous versions, all the LACP negotiation and overhead was handled by the VSM. It would go back and forth discussing it. Now it's all handled by the VEM. If you can't cluster your switches, then MAC pinning is the easiest and works everywhere. I'm not going to say it's the best load balancing mechanism, but it just works everywhere with the least amount of pain. And finally, I talked a minute about how I can have 2 NICs going left and 2 going right and do 2 separate port channels that look like one big connection, and that's called auto or CDP configuration. The 1000V is smart. If you're connected like a Cisco switch, he'll do a CDP kind of like a neighbor command and go, okay, these 2 NICs are connected to the same switch because I see it in CDP neighbor. These are connected to the same switch, CDP neighbor. I know I can port channel those pairs together and then do one large. If you have a question, VPC MAC pinning. That's the easy answer. A couple of physical switch recommendations, real quick. You want to run port fast, edge trunk in NXOS, and you want to enable global, that's a misspelling, BPDU filter and BPDU guard. So you just want to make sure that you're not going to have issues with spanning tree on these edge ports. Nothing crazy there. Make sure all ports are identical. I've seen this more times where some ports are configured one way and some are configured another way, and they work for a while until we have a problem or spanning tree does something wonky. So make sure they're all configured the same way on the physical switches. So here is a physical uplink profile. This is what I would type in to create one of these. So I SSH in the switch, and I type these commands. Let's check my time. Yep, we're going to be tight. So real quick, I SSH in, I log in, I go to config mode like a good little Cisco admin, and I type these commands. Port profile type Ethernet prod uplink. This just says I'm creating a new port profile, type Ethernet. Physical uplink configuration, type Ethernet. Remember I said anytime you hear Ethernet. And the name is prod uplink. Names are case sensitive. If you come back later to make a change and you type port profile type Ethernet lowercase prod uplink, you now have 2 port profiles named prod uplink. One uppercase, one lowercase. VMware port group just defines this as a VMware port group. If for some reason you want to give it a second name that shows up in VMware differently in the first name, that's where you can do it. That's a bad idea. If you're a Cisco person, switch port mode trunk makes a lot of sense. This is a trunk port. I'm going to trunk VLANs over these physical connections. And then you tell it which VLANs you want to allow. I do 5 right here as a demo. You could do switch port, trunk allowed VLAN all, whatever your case may be. Channel group auto mode on MAC pinning. That's a fancy command for I'm using MAC pinning or MAC hashing load balancing. No shutdown, brings it online. System VLAN 5. System VLAN is a special command. What this means is, let's say a vSphere host comes online. He hasn't talked to the VSM yet. He doesn't have current configuration yet. But I use NFS or iSCSI. Or management can't come online because we're running everything through the 1KV. Well, how does he talk to the VSM if he doesn't have current good network configuration? You have a chicken and egg problem. System command says, if you see something tagged VLAN 5, just send it. Don't ask questions. Don't worry about what your config status is. Just send it. And so you want to set system VLAN on any VLAN that's going to carry management, control, packet, NFS, iSCSI, FT, or vMotion. I know it's a lot of things, right? But anything like that, and that's well documented. You just want to make sure that you do that as system VLAN. Then the last command is state enabled. When you type state enabled, you're going to see a task, or a couple of tasks, kick off in vCenter. That means it pushed it to vCenter. Here is a Ethernet port profile. So when you call the network team, or if you're the network team and the vSphere guy calls you and says, we need to attach a server to VLAN 5, this is what you would type in. This is going to be how you create a port group in the 1KV that shows up in vCenter. Looks very similar. Port profile type, vEthernet, remember, virtual, and the name. I'm a fan of using the VLAN name. Again, case sensitive. VMware port group, same command. VMware max ports 256. So this sets the number of basically VM NICs that you can plug into this port group. When you plug in 256, it's full. When you plug in 257, you're going to get an error that says you're out of ports. You just come in here and type VMware max ports, 300. The default setting is 32. Okay? I used to get a lot of calls on this. 33rd NIC, people would freak out. What do you mean it only does 32? Well, just go and type this command. It's non-disruptive. So go ahead and do it up front. Don't set it to some crazy, wacky number. There is an upper limit of what the entire switch can do. Just keep it reasonable. 256 is normally reasonable, but make your own estimate. Switch port mode access. This is an access switch. When I plug a VM into it, I'm not gonna have tagged frames going in and out. It's just like plugging into an access port. VLAN 5, no shut. System VLAN has to be in both places. If it's not in both places, it will not work usually. So if you set 5, 10, 15, and 20 on the uplink, you need to have 5, 10, 15, 20 across your different port profiles. It has to be in both places. If you swear to me that your control VLAN is correctly trunked all over the place and you're still not seeing correct configuration, odds are you're missing your system VLAN command somewhere. And finally, state enabled. Deploying VSMs or VEMs are easy. You can do it manually with a command line, or you can just let VEM do it. If you use VMware Update Manager and you add a host to the distributed switch, VEM will just push down. What's the great thing about VEM? It knows the right build number. You don't have to worry about it. So let VEM do it if you're using VEM. I'm going to speak a little quicker. Screenshot doing a manual install on vSphere 5 using the ESX CLI software VIB install command. VEM is a preferred method. The only issue is if you upgrade really fast, like the day after CIsco releases a build, I've actually seen it where the VEM is not on the repository yet, and you have to do a manual install. Real quick walkthrough of deploying a host. Deploying a host to the 1000v is just like the vSphere distributed switch. This is one thing you do from vCenter. There's only one big difference. Here's the difference. You go into the distributed switch in vCenter, you go to the host tab, you right-click, you say add host. It says which host and which NICs. So I pick those. Here's the difference. On the vSphere distributed switch, I don't get to choose my uplinks. He's only got one uplink configuration. Here, I've got 3. One of them is a unused or quarantine, which is built in. The other ones are DMZ or prod. So DMZ could be one set of NICs for one set of VLANs, and prod would be the others. You can do this on the 1KV. You can't do that on the VDS. There are ways around it on the VDS, so no one from VMware gets mad at me. But you can just do it here, and that's a big difference on the deployment. And once he's done and hits next, VEM will push down the VEM, and everything gets installed. Also here, he will roll over your VM kernel interfaces if you want, and you can go through and pick and choose which VMs you want to move from old style port group to new style port group. So in one quick wizard, once the switch is configured, I can roll a host entirely over. Management VM kernels, NFS, iSCSI, and VMs all in one shot. And as long as your configuration is good, and I highly suggest you test it on a test server first, you can do this with no disruption. I've deployed 1KVs in production environments in the middle of the day with no downtime. So if you understand the methodology and you're very deliberate and methodical, you can absolutely do this. A couple of things. This is a show module command. I know I'm talking faster. Show module command. What do we have? Since I can't see it either. Module 1, VSM active. Module 2, HA standby. What I'm waiting on here is we're going to see this host I just deployed show up as a new module. So I give it a few seconds. Don't freak out if it takes 3 or 4 minutes. I have actually seen that and everything be fine. And did it again. Back up. Back up. Back up. Oh, come on. Here it is. So, down at the bottom, Module 4 and the name of the server. Server's name's Bumblebee. I'm a big Transformers fan if you haven't seen any of my lab stuff. The next thing I'm going to do is show interfaces brief. What he does is a couple things here. First of all, he shows all the interfaces. Right here, if I can see, is Ethernet 3 and 4. That is the two NICs on the physical server and a port channel. Ethernet, what did I say about Ethernet? Physical. So it's Ethernet 1 and 2. Those are the two NICs that I rolled over. Down at the bottom, it's PO 1, 2, and 3. PO, I believe it's 3, is the port channel that I created. It shows up just like a physical switch. And then down here at the bottom is Ethernet 1. I rolled over a NIC from one of the VMs. He is now Ethernet 1. First VM you roll in the switch is 1. Second one's 2. Third one's 3 and on. They will always be 1, 2, and 3 until you delete them. No matter where you vMotion them, no matter what controls you put on them, 1 is always 1 until you delete it. That's great. If I put an access list on Ethernet 1, no matter what happens, he's still Ethernet 1. Troubleshooting. This can seem daunting. A couple of things because I'm about out of time. And I got 3 minutes. Troubleshooting can seem daunting. The problem is that people see this as a complex environment, and when things get weird, they don't know where to start. So I've told you a few things about control and management, VLANs, and pieces like that. So the first thing is narrow down the problem. Is it switch-wide, or is it one host over there that I made a change and something's not happening? Or is it everything's working great, but I made a change to a VM and it's not showing up in vCenter? Where's the problem? CIsco has a great troubleshooting guide. It used to not be great. Now it's very good as it walks you through things. Type this and see what happens. If this happens, go left. If that happens, go right. I call it the little troubleshooting, the old choose-your-own-adventure guides when we were kids. It's very much what it's like. It's good. And at the end of the presentation, I'll leave you a link, is a guy by the name of Louis Wada does a session at CIsco Live that is 90 slides and 2 hours long, so I can't give any sort of look at that level on troubleshooting. Now, don't let it freak you out that thing's 90 slides long. He's just really thorough, and he walks you through all sorts of possible things and what to look for. So I'll have a link for that at the end. VSM's real easy. Check your control VLAN. I know I keep saying it, but it's the truth. And if you make a change, like I create a new port group and it doesn't show up in vCenter, you can do a show command, show SVS connection, and you want to look here and here to make sure it's actually connected to vCenter. If for some reason it disconnects because it dropped connection, it won't push changes. It's easy. You just go in there and type connect, and it talks to vCenter. Or you can ping it and make sure it's good. That's the two big normal problems we see. If you're having VEM issues, it's almost always control VLAN. If a host isn't registering, that's usually it. If you're doing layer 3, just do a simple ping. If you can't ping it, then it's another problem. Several commands on the host. You've got VEM status. It'll show you if the VEM is loaded and running. And VEM command is a very powerful tool. You can do a lot of powerful things, checking configurations, MAC addresses, see what you're seeing, make sure you're talking to VSMs, all sorts of stuff. Louis covers that far better than I ever could in this session. Quick recommendations. Control network is key. I already told you this. Match the VM and VSM version. You can upgrade one, like the VSM, to a newer version, usually one level up. Then the VEM, always suggested to run them at the same level. Physical switches and ports should be identical configuration. We covered that. And if you always want a certain vSphere host to always be a certain module number, you can hard code things. Really, they should always stay the same module number, but Louis says he gets this question a lot, so I added it. Quick recap. I'll recap while this is up here so you can write this URL down or come up and take a picture. Don't let a little bit of extra complexity scare you off from the 1000v. It's a really, really great tool. It's very powerful. It's very configurable. It's got a lot of good extensible options with things like VSG, VWAS, and the new coming ASA. Just understand how things communicate, understand the components, and know how you deploy them. The hardest part of this is the first day of deployment. After that, it gets a lot easier and a lot simpler, and once you understand how things talk, I think you'll be very pleased with it. But I thank you again. Please fill out your surveys. If there's anything you'd like to see changed, I gave this presentation last year. This is completely revised and totally different, but I'm always looking for good feedback. We're probably about out of time, but I've got a while to stick around here and out in the hall, so I'm happy to answer any questions. But thank you again, and hope you like VMware.